The shell arrived before the sound. That was how American soldiers learned to identify it. Not by the boom of the gun that fired it. That came later, rolling across the fields of France like distant thunder. No, you heard the shell first. A high, sharp crack splitting the air, then the explosion. Then, if you were lucky enough to still be breathing, the distant report of the cannon. And then you knew. The 88 had found someone. It was September 1944, deep in the rolling countryside of Lorraine, France. General George S. Patton's Third Army was moving east like a storm front, tearing through what remained of German resistance with a fury that hadn't been seen since Napoleon. 6 weeks earlier, Patton had been confined to England, a puppet in a deception scheme designed to trick Hitler. Now he was the most feared general on the Western Front, and his armored columns were threatening to drive straight into the industrial heart of Germany before winter closed in. But somewhere out there in the fog and the mud of Lorraine, the Germans had set their trap. And at the center of that trap was a weapon that had terrorized Allied soldiers, from the sands of North Africa to the forests of Normandy. A weapon so dreaded that American GIs couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't stop cursing it, couldn't stop telling stories about it around every campfire from Sicily to the Siegfried Line. The Germans called it the Acht-Acht, the 8-8. The Americans just called it the 88. And here is the extraordinary thing about what happened in those hills of Lorraine. The gun that tried to stop George Patton, the gun that had terrorized an entire generation of Allied soldiers and was already obsolete. The Germans knew it. Their own engineers had known it for years. The Wehrmacht had developed better, more powerful, more precise successors. And yet there it stood, on its great cruciform platform, its long barrel leveled at American armor, manned by young men who had no choice but to fight with what they had. Today we tell the full story, the birth of a legend, the battles that made it famous, the hidden vulnerabilities that were there from the beginning, and the moment in Lorraine when American ingenuity, firepower, and Patton's ferocious drive proved that even a legend, even a weapon that had paralyzed armies, could be defeated, outthought and left rusting in a French field. If you want stories like this, history told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that bell. This is history worth knowing. Let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand the 88, you have to understand a secret kept for more than a decade, buried inside bureaucratic paperwork and corporate arrangements in a foreign country, right under the noses of Allied inspectors who were supposed to prevent exactly this from happening. The year was 1919. The guns had barely cooled from the Great War. Europe lay in ruins, 12 million dead, and the victorious Allied powers gathered in the Palace of Versailles outside Paris to dictate terms to a defeated Germany. Among those terms was a provision intended to prevent Germany from ever threatening its neighbors again. Germany was forbidden from developing new weapons systems, including artillery above a certain size. The great German arms manufacturers, Krupp of Essen, Rheinmetall of Düsseldorf, were to be watched, monitored, constrained. What the Allied inspectors didn't know was that the Germans had found a way around them. Krupp, one of the most powerful industrial companies in European history, made a quiet arrangement with the Swedish arms firm AB Bofors. The deal was elegant in its deception. Krupp engineers would travel to Sweden, to the Bofors facilities at Karlskoga, and there, far from the eyes of Versailles inspectors, they would continue developing the weapons that Germany was forbidden to build at home. In 1925, German military planners issued specifications for a new anti-aircraft gun. Bombers were getting higher, faster, more capable. Germany needed something that could reach them. The engineers in Sweden went to work. They experimented with a 75mm design, found it lacking. They pushed to 88mm, a caliber long favored by the Imperial German Navy for its combination of shell weight, muzzle velocity, and the simple fact that 88mm ammunition was considered the largest and heaviest that a single man could comfortably handle. In the heat of battle. By 1928, they had a prototype. In 1931, a satisfactory design. In 1933, the same year Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and the Nazi rearmament program began in earnest. Full-scale production was underway. The gun was designated the 8.8mm FlaK 18. The 18 was itself a deception, implying the design was merely a copy of a 1918 wartime model, when in reality it represented a dramatic leap forward. It was a marvel of engineering. The barrel could elevate to 85 degrees for anti-aircraft work, then depress to 3 degrees below horizontal for ground targets. It could rotate a full 360 degrees on its cruciform platform. A trained crew of 10 to 11 men could bring the weapon into action, from its traveling position in roughly 2.5 minutes, firing up to 15 to 20 rounds per minute. The gun fired a 17-pound shell with a muzzle velocity of nearly 2,700 feet per second, fast enough that at medium ranges the gunner barely needed to compensate for the drop of the projectile. Point and shoot, point and shoot. But here is something important to understand, something that gets lost in the legend. The 88 was designed to shoot airplanes. That was its job. That was what those engineers in Sweden had been asked to build. The fact that it could also kill tanks, that it would go on to become the most feared anti-tank gun of the entire Second World War, was in the beginning almost an accident, a discovery made by necessity in the crucible of combat. The discovery happened in Spain. In 1936, civil war tore the Iberian Peninsula apart. General Francisco Franco's nationalist forces rose against the elected Republican government, and the conflict quickly became a testing ground for the great powers, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy supporting Franco, the Soviet Union supporting the Republic. For Germany, Spain was a laboratory, an opportunity to test new weapon systems, new tactics, new doctrines under real combat conditions. 4 batteries of 80mm FlaK, 18 guns, 16 weapons in total, arrived with the German Condor Legion. Their mission was anti-aircraft defense. Protect the airfields, shoot down Republican bombers. They were good at it, but Spain had a chaotic, fluid, constantly shifting front line. And the Republic had Soviet-supplied tanks. Not many tanks, not great tanks, but tanks that the standard German anti-tank gun of the era, the 37mm Pak-36, could not reliably stop. Someone decided to depress the barrel of an 88, to aim it not at the sky but at the earth, at the approaching armor, and the results were conclusive and immediate. The 80mm shell went through Soviet-built tanks as though they were made of cardboard. The gun's range, far exceeding that of any dedicated anti-tank weapon, meant it could engage targets before they came close enough to fight back effectively. A German general named Ludwig Ritter von Eimansberger saw what was happening and began writing about it. Not just that it could be done, but that it should be incorporated into doctrine. By the end of the Spanish Civil War, German tactical thinking had been quietly transformed. They understood something that Allied military planners would not grasp for years. A high-velocity, heavy-caliber anti-aircraft gun could double as perhaps the finest anti-tank weapon in the world. Poland, September 1939. France, May 1940. The guns were there, moving with the Panzer spearheads, not always used in the anti-tank role. Most 88 production went to static air defense, but used enough to matter. Used enough that the Allied soldiers who survived, encounters with them began to talk, to warn each other, to develop what would become a very particular kind of dread. At Arras in France on May 21, 1940, a force of British Matilda II tanks drove into the advancing German 7th Panzer Division and caused, for a brief, terrifying moment, something close to panic. The standard German anti-tank guns could barely scratch a Matilda's armor. The division commander, a general named Erwin Rommel, had to personally organize a gun line, 25mm howitzers and 88mm FlaK guns to stop the British advance. He did. The 88s killed the Matildas at ranges where the tank's own guns couldn't reach, the German positions. Rommel would not forget what he had seen. And when he took his Arracourt to the deserts of North Africa, he took his 88s with him. North Africa, 1941 and 1942. This is where the legend was truly born. Rommel was a battlefield genius, and he was usually at a disadvantage in terms of numbers. Fewer tanks than the British, chronically short of fuel and ammunition, supply lines stretching across hundreds of miles of Mediterranean sea lanes, menaced by Allied aircraft, and submarines. He couldn't win a head-to-head slugfest, so he didn't try. Instead, he turned the 88 into a trap. British tank commanders, aggressive and determined, would see German armor falling back and pursue. They would accelerate. They would see a chance for the kill. And then they would drive directly into a carefully prepared line of 88-meter guns, hull down in the desert, waiting. The results were devastating. The guns' extraordinary range meant it could open fire before British tank crews even knew they were within its reach. The British called what happened to their tanks brewing up, a horrible euphemism for the moment when an 80-meter shell punched through armor and set off the ammunition stored inside, turning a tank into a furnace with a crew. By the end of 1941, just 2 German Luftwaffe FlaK battalions, with a total authorized strength of 24 88mm guns, had destroyed 264 tanks and 42 aircraft in North Africa. 24 guns. The British, meanwhile, had possessed more than 3 times as many of their own equivalent heavy anti-aircraft guns, the excellent 3.7-inch QF, and almost never used them in the anti-tank role. The weapon existed, the doctrine did not. And that difference alone cost the British Army hundreds of tanks and thousands of men. The news traveled to every theater, every front, every Allied army. Stories of the 88 went ahead of the gun itself, creating a psychological weight that multiplied its effectiveness far beyond what any technical specification could measure. American soldiers arriving in North Africa in late 1942 had already heard the stories. They came pre-terrified, and that fear, that completely rational, completely justified fear, would stay with Allied soldiers for the rest of the war. A cartoon appeared in the Stars and Stripes newspaper, the publication for American servicemen. An American intelligence officer was interrogating prisoners, and standing nearby was an anxious GI. The officer looked over and said, "Don't worry, if I find out who invented the 88, I'll let you know." It was dark humor, gallows humor, the kind men make when the alternative is too grim to consider. The 88 had become so famous, so feared, that even American cartoonists couldn't stop thinking about it. But here is the paradox at the heart of this story. The very qualities that made the 80mm FlaK so lethal also contained the seeds of its limitations. And as the war ground on, those limitations became harder and harder to ignore. Think about what the FlaK 18, 36, and 37 actually were. They were anti-aircraft guns. They were designed to be tall. They needed elevation to track aircraft across the sky. That height, that commanding silhouette, became a fatal vulnerability the moment the gun was turned against a ground enemy who could shoot back. The 80mm FlaK stood nearly 7 feet tall even when deployed in its firing position. Against aircraft, that height was irrelevant. Airplanes didn't care about the gun's silhouette. But against tanks, against infantry, against counter-battery artillery fire, that tall platform announced the gun's location to every enemy within miles. It was almost impossible to camouflage effectively. German crews tried. They would stack sandbags, pile whatever material was available, try to break up the distinctive outline against the horizon. But that long barrel gave it away every time. It required 11 men to operate at full efficiency. 11 men in the open, exposed to the full violence of the battlefield, with relatively little protection. Moving the gun required a half-track tractor, the massive STK F7, and even a well-trained crew needed 2.5 minutes to bring the weapon into action. In the fast-moving, chaotic combat of 1944, 2.5 minutes could be a lifetime. Most critically, the 88 FlaK was fundamentally a defensive weapon. It needed to be set up in a prepared position. It needed to be emplaced, leveled, connected to its fire control systems. This is why historians have noted that during the production period, from October 1943 to November 1944, approximately 61% of all 88mm FlaK guns produced were intended for static defense. The weapon that the Allies feared most was, by its very nature, something that couldn't keep up. With a war in which speed and mobility had become the decisive factors, German engineers knew this. They had known it almost from the beginning. The FlaK 18 was described by its own designers as lacking the characteristics of an anti-tank gun, except firepower. The 37mm Pak 36, the dedicated anti-tank weapon of the early war years, was easy to move, easy to hide, easy to manhandle into position. The 88 FlaK was none of these things. It was powerful. It was accurate. It was terrifying. But it was also, in technical terms, a compromise, a weapon pressed into a role. for which it had not been designed, succeeding through sheer ballistic brute force when subtlety would have served better. And the terrain of Western Europe in 1944 was, in important ways, unkind to the 88. The gun's great advantage was range. In the open desert, it could engage. At 2,000 meters, 3,000 meters, distances at which American tank guns simply couldn't fight back effectively. But in the hedgerow country of Normandy, in the forests of the Ardennes, in the rolling farmland of Lorraine, range was less decisive than in the open deserts. You couldn't always see 2 miles in Normandy. The terrain that allowed American infantry to approach under cover was the same terrain that denied the 88 its greatest advantage. And in close terrain, a weapon that was difficult to move and impossible to hide effectively became not a terror but a target. German ordnance designers had understood for years that the 88 FlaK needed a successor in the anti-tank role, a dedicated weapon, lower, more mobile, more concealable, with even higher muzzle velocity. By 1942, Krupp had designed exactly this weapon, the 8.8 cm Pak 43, the Panzerabwehrkanone. It was superior to the FlaK in almost every relevant category as a tank killer. Lower silhouette, better penetration, more practical carriage. By the late war, it would serve as the main gun on the Tiger II, the King Tiger, and on fearsome tank destroyers like the Jagdpanther and the Elephant. But the Pak 43 had its own problems. It was too expensive, too complex for wartime mass production, too heavy for its crews to manhandle in an emergency. Allied bombing destroyed one of the primary carriage production facilities, further slowing output. Their field expedient variant, the Pak 43-41, was improvised using an existing howitzer carriage, but it proved so awkward and unwieldy that German troops gave it an indelicate nickname. They called it the Scheunentor, the barn door. It couldn't be easily moved or emplaced, and it sank dramatically into muddy terrain. The weapon intended to replace the aging FlaK was itself barely adequate. By October 1944, Germany had only 578 Pak 43s in Wehrmacht service across the entire front. That was the replacement for the 88 FlaK, 578 guns for thousands of miles of front lines, while the old FlaK, imperfect, vulnerable but still deadly, remained in service by the tens of thousands, kept fighting long past its tactical prime because nothing adequate had been provided to take its place. Now return with me to Lorraine, September 1944. The fog lying heavy on the hills above the Moselle River. Patton's Third Army had been moving so fast since the breakout from Normandy at the end of July that it had outrun its own supply lines. For a few weeks in early September, Patton's tanks had barely enough fuel to keep moving. The famous supply crisis of late summer 1944, when Eisenhower's logistical system simply couldn't keep up with the speed of the Allied advance. Patton had been furious. He had seen the opportunity to drive straight through the weakened German defenses into Germany itself. He believed, and historians have subsequently argued he was right, that a sustained offensive in early September could have ended the war before Christmas. But fuel was fuel, and without it even the Third Army stopped. The pause gave the Germans time to bring up reserves, to organize a counterattack, to try to stabilize a front that had been on the edge of complete collapse. Hitler demanded action. He ordered the 5th Panzer Army, under General Hasso von Manteuffel, to strike directly at Patton's exposed spearhead in Lorraine. The objective was to retake Lunéville and destroy the American bridgehead over the Moselle River. If successful, it would buy time, relieve pressure, perhaps turn the tide of a campaign that was sliding inexorably against Germany. Manteuffel had 3 new panzer brigades at his disposal, the 111th, 112th, and 113th. On paper, it looked formidable. In reality, these units were critically under-strength in experienced personnel. The troops were new. The commanders had taken over their units only days before the offensive was to begin. The Panther tanks assigned to the brigades were arriving directly from the factory floor, in some cases still working out mechanical defects that would have been caught during normal unit training. And critically, the Germans had almost no air support. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of what it had been. Allied air power controlled the skies over Lorraine almost without opposition, standing between this German counterattack and the objectives it intended to destroy. was Combat Command A of the U.S. 4th Armored Division, part of General Manton Eddy's 2e Corps. The 4th Armored was one of Patton's best formations, aggressive, well-led, experienced from the breakout through France. Its commander, the indomitable Major General John Tiger Jack Wood, was a man who operated on Patton's own wavelength. Attack, always attack. Keep moving, keep the enemy off balance. And embedded in the 4th Armored's combat command was the 37th Tank Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, a man who would go on to become one of the most celebrated armor commanders in American military history, and whose name is today carried by the M1 Abrams main battle tank. The German attack began on the morning of September 19, 1944. The fog was thick, heavy, cold, wet, the kind of fog that turns the world to grey soup and reduces visibility to a few dozen yards. In that fog, German Panther tanks moved toward the American positions, their long 75mm guns reaching ahead of them, their crews tense and uncertain, in a terrain they didn't know, against an enemy whose exact positions they hadn't been able to accurately determine. But the fog, it turned out, was a weapon in the hands of the Americans. The 80mm FlaK's greatest advantage was range. In the open desert, it could engage at 2,000 meters, 3,000 meters, distances at which American tank guns simply couldn't fight back effectively. But in the fog of Lorraine on the morning of September 19th, range was meaningless. You couldn't see 2,000 meters. You could barely see 200. And in that restricted visibility, the advantages shifted dramatically. American M4 Sherman tanks, hunting by sound and shadow, encountered German Panthers and Panzer IVs at close quarters, ranges where the Sherman's 75mm gun could inflict real damage, ranges that robbed the German crews of their most powerful asset. Meanwhile, American artillery was devastating. The Germans were attacking across open ground, in massed formations, and American forward observers were calling in fire with deadly efficiency. The 1911 Tactical Air Command, whenever the weather cleared even briefly, sent P-47 Thunderbolts screaming down on German armor formations. One extraordinary figure, Major Bazooka Charlie Carpenter, an Army observation pilot who had fitted his tiny Piper L4 Cub with a pair of bazookas, was personally diving through German ground fire to attack enemy tanks. With a Piper Cub, armed with anti-tank rockets, in the middle of one of the largest armored battles on the Western Front, where the 88-meter guns did appear at Arracourt, and they did appear, in prepared defensive positions around the town of Valhay, where the 37th Tank Battalion famously cleared the town of 8 80mm anti-tank guns and 300 Germans before continuing its advance. They were powerful and dangerous in their static emplacements. An 88 in a prepared position, with clear fields of fire manned by experienced crew, was still a deadly proposition in 1944. But the American tactical solution had evolved. Since North Africa, they didn't drive straight at it anymore. They flanked it. They used artillery smoke to blind the gun crews. They called in airstrikes. They used the terrain. The lessons had been paid for in blood in Africa and Italy and Normandy, but they had been learned. The GI who first saw an 88 in 1942 and froze in terror was not the GI who encountered an 88 in France in 1944. This was a different army. An army that had figured out how to fight back. The Battle of Arracourt lasted 11 days, September 18 through September 29, 1944. It would become known as the U.S. Army's largest tank-versus-tank engagement until the Battle of the Bulge in December. When it was over, the numbers told a brutal story. Of the 262 German tanks and assault guns committed to the battle, 200 had been damaged or destroyed. American losses amounted to 48 tanks. The German 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades had been effectively shattered as cohesive combat units. The 5th Panzer Army's offensive had been broken decisively. Manteuffel would later write that Patton could easily have pushed through to the Saar and the Rhine. In September 1944, if he had been given a free hand, that the West Wall was still unmanned, that no effective defense could have been mounted. It was the logistical halt, and then Eisenhower's decision to prioritize Montgomery's operation in the north, not German resistance, that stopped Patton. And the 88, on the battlefields of Lorraine, in the hedgerows of Normandy, in the rubble of every German city that Allied forces fought through in 1944 and 1945, the FlaK 88 was still there, still deadly, still capable of killing at extreme range on days when the weather was clear and the terrain was open. It never stopped being dangerous. You never stopped fearing the crack of that incoming round that arrived before the sound of the gun. But it was fighting on borrowed time. The war had moved past it. The doctrine of combined arms, tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power, working together in a coordinated team, had found the counter to the gun that once seemed unstoppable. The Americans in particular had developed an artillery system of remarkable sophistication. The concept of time on target, coordinating multiple batteries to have their rounds impact simultaneously, concentrating devastating firepower on a single point, was something no static gun emplacement could survive. The 80mm FlaK crews could be lethal, but they were also conspicuous, heavy, slow to reposition, and devastatingly vulnerable to the kind of concentrated artillery fire that the Americans delivered with industrial efficiency. By late 1944, 80mm FlaK crews in Germany were being ordered to restrict their ammunition expenditure because the shells were expensive and in short supply. Gun crews who had been feared across 3 continents were now rationing their rounds. The gun that had defined an era was running out of time, along with the regime it served. There is something important to say about the men who served those guns. History is easy to tell as a story of weapons and tactics and generals, of specifications and kill ratios and production numbers. But behind every 88mm gun in France, in North Africa, in Russia, there was a crew of young men, usually young men who had been called up into the Luftwaffe's FlaK arm. Not to stop tanks, not to fight in the mud of a French field, but to defend cities and airfields against Allied bombers. These were not in most cases ideological warriors. They were mechanic sons from Stuttgart, farmers' boys from Bavaria, young men who had been handed a gun and told to point it at whatever needed to be destroyed today. A German battery commander captured by American forces after the war gave this account of what it was like to man an 88 on the Western Front. "I was on a hill as a battery commander with 6 anti-tank guns, and the Americans kept sending tanks down this road. Every time they sent a tank, we knocked it out. Finally, we ran out of ammunition, and the Americans didn't run out of tanks." In those words, spare, unadorned, without self-pity, is the entire story of Germany's war in miniature. The tactical excellence, the kills, the moment when tactical excellence ran into industrial reality, and the moment when a man who had done everything asked of him simply had nothing left to give. We should also be honest about something that the mythology of the 88 sometimes obscures. The Allied armies were not helpless against it. The British had the 17-pounder, an excellent anti-tank gun, that could match the 88's performance at most combat ranges. The Soviets had the 85mm, which they fitted to their T-34 tanks, and which gave them the ability to fight German armor on more equal terms. The Americans had the 90mm gun, fitted to the M36 tank destroyer, and later to the M26 Pershing heavy tank, that could do everything the 88 could do. What had made the 88 so dominant early in the war was not solely technical superiority. It was doctrinal innovation. It was Rommel understanding that a high-velocity anti-aircraft gun could be used as a tank trap before Allied commanders grasped the vulnerability being exploited. That window of doctrinal advantage eventually closed. By 1944, every Allied army had studied the 88, understood it, developed countermeasures, trained its soldiers to recognize and respond to it. The terror diminished, not because the gun became less deadly, but because the men facing it became more capable of fighting back. Patton never forgot the 88. None of his veterans did. But by the time Third Army was racing through France, those veterans had also stopped fearing it, the way they once had. They feared it. But they didn't freeze. They adapted. They flanked. They called in artillery. They used smoke. They advanced under fighter-bomber cover. They learned, the hard and costly way, that the most terrifying weapon in the world is still just a weapon, and weapons can be counted. After the war, the 88 found its way into unexpected places. Allied soldiers discovered that Spain was still operating FlaK 18s from weapons received during the Civil War. Finland had bought 98.8 cm FlaK 37 guns from Germany in 1943 and 1944 and used them for air defense against Soviet bombing raids. After the war, the Finns kept them in service as anti-aircraft guns until 1977, and then as coastal defense weapons until the early 2000s. France equipped 3 artillery regiments with captured German 88s in March 1945, using them against their former owners in the final weeks of the war. These captured guns remained in service with French second-line units until 1953. Yugoslavia used 80mm guns in its civil wars of the 1990s, a design conceived in secret in a Swedish factory in the 1920s, secretly developed against the terms of a peace treaty, magnificent in the open desert. Fired its last military rounds as the 20th century was drawing to a close. The bloodline of the gun lives on today in a different form. The fundamental principle, high-velocity, large-caliber gunfire, against both air and ground targets, is the basis of modern air defense artillery, modern tank main guns, modern anti-aircraft systems that protect carrier battle groups. The legacy of those Krupp engineers in Sweden is embedded in the architecture of modern warfare itself. And the M1 Abrams tank, the tank named for the man who fought the 88s. At Arracourt in September 1944, Creighton Abrams carries a 120-meter smoothbore main gun, whose lethality would have been unimaginable. To the German crews who faced his Shermans in the fog of Lorraine, the student became the standard. The army that had to learn, painfully and at great cost, how to fight the 88, built the weapons that define armored warfare today. George Patton drove his Third Army across France and into Germany, through the Lorraine campaign, and the relief of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, and the crossing of the Rhine, and the final collapse of the Third Reich. He did it in the face of fuel shortages, political interference, logistical crises, and German resistance that was, even in the last months of the war, formidable and deadly. He never claimed to have made it look easy. He never minimized the cost. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, what it took to move an army across a continent in the face of an enemy willing to die to stop it. The 80mm FlaK gun was a legend. It remains a legend. No honest accounting of World War II can ignore the role it played, the fear it inspired, the lives it took, or the tactical revolution it embodied. It was a weapon ahead of its doctrine, a weapon that required a commander like Rommel to see its potential and the courage to use it against the orthodox expectations of conventional warfare. But it was also a weapon trapped in time. Born in the 1920s, secretly developed against the terms of a peace treaty, magnificent in the open desert, deadly but increasingly vulnerable in the hedgerows and forests of 1944, unable to keep pace with the doctrine and technology that answered it. By the time Patton drove his army east through Lorraine, the gun that tried to stop him was fighting on borrowed time, manned by men who deserved better. From the regime that sent them to fight with weapons, their own engineers had already conceded needed replacing. The Americans ran out of tank after tank in North Africa. They ran out of patience with unnecessary losses in Normandy. They never ran out of tanks. They never ran out of determination. And in the end, the battery commander's words, quiet, resigned, honest, said everything that needed to be said about what happens when the mightiest weapon of an era meets an industrial nation fully committed to winning. We ran out of ammunition. They didn't run out of tanks. That, more than any technical specification, is the story of the 88mm gun and the men who crossed oceans to destroy it. If this story meant something to you, if you believe that history is worth understanding, with depth and honesty and the full weight of its human cost, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the like button. Share this with someone who would want to know this story. Leave a comment telling us which battle or weapon you'd like us to cover next. We read everyone. And ring that notification bell, because there is much more history ahead. Stories of courage and ingenuity, of weapons and the men who used them, of wars fought and won by ordinary people in extraordinary times. We'll see you in the next one.